I was born in San Jose. So was my father. I've lived in Cambrian Park for over 50 years. And now I'm considering purchasing a handgun because I do not feel safe in my home. And I would like you to speak to what I believe is a failure of leadership on the city council to make the people of at least Cambrian Park, where no house sells under $1 million, safe in their home.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here this morning. And I'm going to answer the question in just a second. I'd just like to at least offer a couple introductory remarks. First, an apology. I know that we were scheduled to be here. I was scheduled to be here a few weeks ago. I think many of you know we lost Officer Mike Catherman the night before that scheduled appearance. At several of my appearances in organizations like this, we have media show up. We all agreed it would not be appropriate for me to be talking about what the police did well or poorly on that night involving the Trump rally. The night after we lost a police officer, we wanted to avoid those conversations for a day or two to allow, obviously, the family and the rest of the department to be able to grieve appropriately. I appreciate your patience and having me back immediately thereafter. I also want to thank my Chief of Staff, Jim, who I understand bravely stood in. That is true duty. So thank you, Jim. So thank you for having me. I'm happy to talk about the Trump rally as well. I know there's a lot of questions and concerns about that, and so I'll jump into that in a moment. Let me first address your question. There is no question that we are sorely stretched right now in terms of police resources. When I came into office in 2007, along with Mayor Reed, we had about 1,400 police officers. We have lost over 500 officers in that period of time. Over a third of our force. I think we all know well what happened between 2007 and today. Over the last decade, we've endured a very severe recession. We had layoffs. We had hiring freezes. We had pay cuts. We had pension reform. We had a lot of challenges, and all of those things resulted in a severe loss of our department. We also had a huge spike in retirements, both because of those factors and the fact that we had baby boomers who were simply retiring. We knew with the demographics we were going to have a hard time hanging on to folks. So this unquestionably has been the most challenging time for our department in anyone's memory. That being said, I feel very confident that we are pulling out of this. And we have the leadership now in the department, that is Eddie Garcia, our police chief. And we have a very clear plan for how we're going to rebuild this department, that we're now in a position where we can actually see the light at the end of the tunnel. And specifically, I'm referring to a few issues. One is we know, and we've been hearing loud and clear, that the battles over pension reform have made it difficult for us to retain and to attract officers. Now, I say that being a guy who advocated for pension reform. I believe Chuck Reed did exactly the right thing. I stand by his decision and by my decision to push for pension reform, and it was absolutely needed to deal with the crisis. Nonetheless, we know it had impacts. We know it had consequences. And one of those consequences was it made us significantly less competitive compared to surrounding jurisdictions, particularly given the fact that we already pay considerably less on average than many of the jurisdictions in the South Bay and in the rest of the Bay Area. And so we had to somehow or another resolve that battle. And the good news is, coming to an agreement with 11 unions, we now have a deal that will save taxpayers $3 billion over the next 30 years, and importantly, provide officers a sense that they will be protected if they're disabled. That was a huge issue, we know, with the pension reform that passed in 2012, that there is a set of benefits, while not as high as other jurisdictions, at least is competitive. And we will be able to enact this when the voters, if the voters approve this in November. We're going to be going to you, the voters, in November of this year, asking for voter approval of the package. The text of that measure will be public, I would expect, within the next week or two. There's already one version of that text that is public, that's on the city website, so you can look at it for yourself. We are negotiating various details. This is very complex. But the good news is the final text, I think, is going to be no more than 3 or 4 pages, so everyone can read it easily and understand exactly what they're voting on. And I'd be happy to answer questions in the months ahead about that measure. That's going to be critically important for us because, as our chief recognizes, and we all recognize, we've got to get that issue resolved before we can fill a police academy anywhere near the numbers that we did in the good old days. Secondly, we've got some recruiting strategies that, believe it or not, the police union is supportive of. We're actually working together on this, for example, to expand hiring for military veterans. Before, we had some pretty restrictive policies. We're now counting military experience as a proxy for education. I think that's going to help us broaden the net as we consider hiring very qualified candidates. We are also expanding programs like PSRP. That's going to enable us to hang on to officers who may have otherwise been retiring, enable them to work for 2 or 3 or 4 years as we attempt to bridge this gap into a period in which we're going to be able to hire more robustly. So the good news is I see that we are, first of all, we have finally stemmed the bleeding. That's critical because the losses were happening at a rate we simply could not replace. And we have a very clear plan for how we're going to be able to aggressively hire and in some cases rehire, because we're hearing loud and clear from officers who are now in other jurisdictions who want to come back to San Jose if we can get this thing resolved. They're saying, we're willing to come back. You guys got to get it resolved first because I'm not going to put my family's future at risk if this thing doesn't pass. So we've got a plan. We've been able to implement enough of this to at least stem the bleeding. In the meantime, there's a lot of other things we need to do, and we're doing now. And we're going to have to continue to do, because we're going to have this shortage of officers for a considerable period of time, for several years. We're not going to fix this overnight. And so we've got to be more efficient and effective with the officers. We've got one of those programs that Chuck Reed started, and we are now expanding rapidly. It's called the Community Service Officer Program. We've heard loud and clear about the frustration of getting responses to burglaries and car break-ins and crimes of that nature. And we know typically, in almost every case with a home burglary, the victim, I know this well because I've been victimized myself by home burglaries, my wife was as well. Typically you get home, the burglar left the house 6 hours before. There's not a lot for a police officer to do except for collecting fingerprints, collecting statements, identifying what's been missing, what's been stolen. We know community service officers can be trained to do those kinds of tasks. And so over the last budget, we've now doubled the number of community service officers so we can improve response to that category of crimes where we know there's not going to be a suspect that needs to be chased down, right? We don't need somebody with a badge and a gun. We need somebody who's trained in forensics to collect evidence, who can take witness statements, et cetera. And so we're expanding that program. And in the last budget, we doubled the number of community service officers, so we're now over 50. We'll be adding some more in the current budget, thanks to the measure that was just passed by the voters. So that's an example of things that we can do given the shortage of officers. We're also investing heavily in technology. For the first time, I think you're going to see a department, although we've been in the middle of Silicon Valley, you wouldn't know it the way we were operating. We're investing significantly in software that's going to help us, for example, better anticipate hotspots of property crime and other kinds of crime using data analytics. We're really investing more heavily in the kinds of technology that will help us anticipate gang crime, recognizing that we know a lot of gang members tend to use social media extensively. So there's a lot we can do with technology to make us safer. License plate readers and other kinds of technology I know Councilmember Camus has been a strong advocate of, and we're making those investments as well. So I don't pretend that it's been easy, and I also don't pretend you're going to believe what I'm about to tell you, but I'm going to tell you this anyway, because I just got back from a gang and youth violence conference in Baltimore 2 nights ago, where I was asked to speak because San Jose's Gang Prevention Task Force has become a model for the rest of the country. Why? Because we have the lowest violent crime rate of any major city in the United States. And you don't have to believe me for this, because I'm an elected official. So don't believe me, look it up for yourself. Go to the FBI website where they list all the cities with a population of 500,000 or more. There's over 30 cities in this country with at least 500,000 people. And San Jose has the lowest violent crime rate. Nonetheless, we know that's not good enough because we're used to being safe. And this year in particular, we're seeing a spike in violent crime that's got us all very concerned. And so we've got a lot more work to do. But I want to assure you that folks are working very hard. And contrary to what you might believe, certainly because we know local media is local media, we do have a model that has been effective enough to be a model that other cities are emulating for gang prevention, particularly in leveraging partnerships with faith communities, nonprofit organizations, with schools, that enables us to get to many kids before the gangs do. And that is a critical strategy for reducing violence. So I've talked a very long time. I'll stop talking on that question because I know I can go on for another hour. I think a lot of people have questions about what happened on the Trump rally, so I think I'd certainly be happy to take those questions. We had a lot of prepared remarks, and I want to put those off so we could just address your questions. What I'd like to do, as folks are coming up, is tell you what we know about the arrests so far with the rally, because there's a lot of information that we've been able to gather, certainly in the last couple of weeks, and I just want to update folks as the first questioner is coming up to the mic. First, there were, according to the San Jose Police Department, 23 reported victims on that night. 22 identified suspects so far, 22 suspects. And I know folks in this room, some who may have attended or have friends or family who attended, we are relying enormously on others to help us identify suspects. And so if there's something that you think you know or someone you know knows that can help us, please go to the website, sapd.org, where we can upload video or photos. Please call the police department. We'd be happy to be able to take additional information that can help us identify suspects. So far, of the 22 identified suspects, we've had 21 arrests. 21 arrests. And there are 4 additional. And I know that applause isn't for me. It's for the hardworking folks in the department. So thank you for that, because folks are working hard on this. In addition, we have, is it 4 more warrants? Is that right, Jim? 4 more outstanding warrants, meaning we know who the person is. We got a warrant out for their arrest. We got to go find them now. So that's the progress to date. The information that I got from the fire department and emergency medical response on the scene of the 23 reported victims, 3 had medical attention on the scene. The reports from the medical professionals were of abrasions and cuts. Each of the 3 individuals declined to be transported to the hospital, declined to have additional medical attention. So the good news is, and I know this is again not something that people are going to be enthusiastic to hear, but let me just say it because I think it needs to be said. Those officers who were in a very difficult situation that night prevented very serious injuries. And we've seen situations like this get very violent, and by violent I mean people going to the hospital with serious injuries and death. The good news is, as bad as this was, and we all agree it was bad, it was awful, the officers on the scene were able to prevent major injuries. And so what we see is a very bad, awful situation, but we need to also recognize there were officers who were there doing everything they could. So that, I'll be happy to take questions.
So if can you hear me with this microphone? So if your number is 1 through 4, 5, if you'll begin to line up, that would be helpful. Please speak very loudly and very slowly.
Great.
So the mayor can understand you and so can the room.
Good morning.
Good morning. Why did you allow San Jose citizens to be brutalized by thugs when they were peacefully exercising their First Amendment constitutional right?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. The question was why did I allow people to be brutalized that night? And I think implicit in the question is a little rumor we've heard on a couple of news stations that somehow or another there was a stand-down order. Is that what you're referring to? That somehow I issued that that I issued a stand-down order to the police department. So let me assure you, first of all, I talked to the police chief extensively about this night. He did not issue any stand-down order. I did not issue any stand-down order. I do not have the power to issue stand-down orders. I don't tell the police department who to arrest. I don't tell the experts in policing how to engage in tactics. That is not my role. Although I am a former criminal prosecutor, I don't pretend to know how police officers should deal with an unruly crowd or with violent people in a crowd of several hundred. We leave those decisions to the experts, and that is the chief and the people who work for the chief who are trained to deal with very difficult situations like that. So there's no question that what happened was awful. We never want to see that in San Jose again. Thank you, Jim. But there was no decision by myself, by the chief, nor by anyone on the scene to stand down. What you did see, and I know it was widely criticized, was the line of officers and officers who did not break the line, it's called a skirmish line, to go into the crowd to make arrests when there was evidence of violence or attacks happening in the crowd. And the chief has had a lengthy press conference on this, and he can certainly respond much more effectively than I can, but I'll briefly describe what I understand to be the situation. When forming a skirmish line, that skirmish line was formed in part to enable folks who were attending the rally to be able to get out behind the officers to get to their intended location. That was to get to their cars. The route, I think many of you have heard, had to be altered. And it had to be altered at the last minute. And that was, I believe, in many ways an unfortunate cause of many of the challenges, because as we look back on this, and the chief I think would be the first to say it, lesson learned was those attendees should have never been sent in the direction they were sent. They should have been, we could have done it differently. We could have done it differently. And it was the fact that they had to make that change that put folks in peril by walking directly east rather than holding them in the facility until we could get the crowd cleared. The officers who were there who were holding the skirmish line were doing so because that is the police tactic. The tactic is to ensure you preserve the folks who are trying to exit and to ensure that you contain the violence so it does not spread, and we've seen in plenty of situations where it can spread like a contagion very, very quickly. If officers break the skirmish line and go into a crowd to make an arrest, presumably they'd have to use force to do so. And then you need several officers to do so. And when you have officers who are breaking away from the line into a crowd using force to effectuate an arrest, things can get very ugly very quickly, both for people in that crowd and for the officers. Now, I'm not an expert in that tactic. I'm telling you what I've been told. And certainly, I know Eddie Garcia, who is our chief, has been working very diligently with the community to explain and answer all these questions. And I should say there's a working group that's been formed and includes several Republicans selected by the GOP County Committee that Eddie started working, the chief started meeting with. He meets regularly with the group. The next meeting is scheduled for this Thursday. And to provide a regular update on prosecution and to answer questions about the tactics that were used that day. So I'm not trying to duck the question. I'm trying to tell you exactly what I know, but I am not the expert in this, and I'm not going to pretend to be the expert. I do believe when you're the mayor that you need to rely on the expertise of those who've been trained to do what they do, just as the president needs to rely on the expertise of military generals who've been trained to do what they do. I believe that while Thank you. I believe we've learned lessons that make it clear that we made mistakes that night and that we could have done things better. There's no question about that. I am not going to second guess every tactic, and I'm certainly not going to second guess the officers who are on the street who are facing a very combustible situation. Those officers, as far as I can tell, did everything they were told to do and did it as well as they possibly could have. So if there were mistakes made, there's no question that our chief has been very clear that we could have done things better, and the thing that we could have done better most clearly was ensure that we had more than 300 officers there. We needed more officers. There's no question about that. We had, I think it was 4 days of notice. Actually, it was Monday that the department was told. It was 3 days? Okay. Monday, the department was told where the rally would be held. Thursday was the day of the rally. Our department scrambled very quickly to get officers together. We had over 300 officers there. Just to give you an indication, in a typical shift, we have somewhere on the order of 120 officers who are patrolling in the entire city during a shift. We had 2.5 times that many people, that many officers at that location for that rally. Now, other cities we've seen, in Anaheim, I think they had 1,000. San Diego, they had 700 officers. Those are also, by the way, areas where officers are more plentiful. I think you all know we have great scarcity in police officers. We have the most thinly staffed department of any major city in the United States. So it is hugely challenging for us to be able to pull a lot of officers off double overtime shifts, et cetera. But they did as well as they could. The lesson learned is we get as much advance notice as possible. The chief is coordinating closely now with the RNC and the local Republican committee to ensure that we have more advance notice so that we can get more officers out there if Trump were to return to San Jose.
Actually, Mayor, if maybe you could keep your responses a little shorter because we've got
Yeah, you can imagine though when someone asserts that you give that you allow people to be brutalized, it's usually not a 3-word response.
Good morning. My name is Mark, and I was part of the Trump rally. And I have a comment based on your long-winded exercise of skirmish. My imposition of it was not during the skirmish line intervention. It was after you had declared, or the city had declared, an unlawful gathering. So that skirmish line was no longer in effect. And your officers were walking the street and denied their oath. So that's my response to what you just went on about. My question is, how well would you rate your service, since you've been quoted as saying, I'm not concerned about petitions from people outside the city because I serve at the pleasure of the people of this fine city, of which I think I am one, on a rating of 0 to 9 or 1 to 10. When you have people attending a peaceful demonstration, being approached by rioters, being engaged by rioters, and being told by officers during that engagement while protecting other individuals that they're not going to assist after they have taken an oath to protect and serve us. I was not served. How would you rate yourself in that answer when I was denied that and I was protecting other citizens? So I'd like to hear how you could respond to that, please.
Yes, and I'm very sorry, sir, for what you experienced. So I'm very sorry. Obviously, whatever you experienced sounds like it was awful. And I could ask, sir, if you were able in any way to get badge numbers of any officer who told you that they would not assist. We have an independent police auditor. We have an independent auditor who is not employed by the police office, by the police department, who's responsible for ensuring that officers are doing their jobs. When the management in any department breaks down, and we know that happens across the country, we have independent oversight, civilian oversight. And so if you have specific information, I'm happy to give you the information you need so that we can report if there's an officer who is simply saying, I'm not going to do X, that we would clearly understand to be their job. In terms of the question about how I'm doing, that's up to the voters. And certainly, I'm not going to second guess the voters. Voters will have an opportunity to determine that. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so as Mark said, we witnessed the violence and the violent crime in our city that night. We witnessed the violent crime in our city that night. We witnessed officers just standing there watching us, watching people getting beaten, watching this lady back here get assaulted. We witnessed somebody trying to protect her. And we also witnessed the police officers after screaming for help, help us, please help us, please help us, please help us. And they didn't respond until finally two walked towards where we were going, trying to. And they said, I'm sorry, we were told to stand down and we can't do anything. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I feel really bad. I'm sorry. That's all they could say. And the officer in charge of that little group said, don't arrest her, because they were yelling, arrest her, arrest her. Oh, I'm so upset. Okay, my question is, why did you jump to the conclusion that Donald Trump was at fault? You said Donald Trump needs to take responsibility for the irresponsible behavior of his campaign. I also thought at one time you said something that he needs to take better control of his supporters. So it seemed like you were blaming us.
No, I wasn't blaming the supporters. I did say...
That's what you said.
So I did say exactly what you quoted before. I did absolutely say that. I'm happy to talk about that. But at no time did I blame the supporters, and nor would I.
If you said Donald Trump needs to get better control, well,
sure.
I want that answer.
And
answer to that question.
So let me explain statements that were made. First, there were statements that were made, I believe I made sometime around 10 o'clock that night, that were recorded by an AP reporter. And those were the statements. Part of what I said was what you just reported about my statements around Donald Trump should take responsibility for his campaign's irresponsible actions. That was included in a longer statement that I gave to an AP reporter. And then within a few hours of that, the very following morning, then I issued an official statement. So first, I clearly should have said, before I said anything else, the night of the incident, that I condemned the violence. I should have clearly said that the violence has no place in San Jose. I clearly should have said that anybody who is coming to a rally with an intention to throw a punch or throw a rock needs to be arrested and convicted and go to jail. All those things were things I said the next morning, immediately after waking up, and I should have said that night. And I made a mistake. And I admitted that very publicly in the past. I'll continue to admit it. I should have said it more clearly and more emphatically. I don't remember everything that I said to the AP reporter that night. It was 10 o'clock at night, and we were rushing back and forth as I was getting reports of officers who were taking rocks and bottles and other things, and we were trying to deal with a very combustible situation. And I did not think through my statements well enough before I made them, and that was a mistake. And so for that, I'm sorry.
Mayor, I guess I'll follow up on Mary's question then.
Sure.
So your statement was, which you said you should have put some other things before that statement, but your statement was that Trump should take responsibility for his
Yes.
supporters. In this age where an entire generation has...
Not for his supporters. That's not what I said.
For
things that he's saying.
For things that he's saying.
Yes, right.
Yeah. So at what point do you think the Democratic leadership needs to take moral responsibility for the things that they're saying, including the teachings of Saul Alinsky, which is basically divisiveness, divide, label, and gender anger, get people very emotionally stirred up over sound bites? At what point does the Democratic leadership, local and national, need to take responsibility for stirring up, very purposely and obviously, this fervor that's leading to this violence?
So I think we all need to take responsibility. Thank you. I think we all need to take responsibility for what we all say, right? And as elected leaders, or what we might say at a protest, if we're trying to say things that'll, incite folks, whatever it might be, we need to take responsibility for our own statements, right? As elected officials in particular. I don't, by the way, ascribe to any of the beliefs of Saul Alinsky. I think, as you know well, lots of Republicans believe lots of things. I know lots of Republicans don't believe everything that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. I don't believe much of what comes out of Saul Alinsky's mouth, so that's not my... I don't agree with everything that comes out of Hillary's mouth. I'm pro-free trade. I'm not thrilled with Hillary Clinton's position on trade. I believe that the position I've always held is that we should support free trade. And, you know, by the way, so we need to be responsible for what we say. And what I was responding to was, I think, something I think we all intuitively know and we can agree with. That is, there's no question, first of all, that people in that audience, there were people among those protesters who were thugs, that were not there to exercise their First Amendment rights. They were there to stir something up and cause violence. And we know that inevitably in a big city, in gatherings, there are going to be thugs. That's the way it works in big cities, right? Inevitably, someone is going to be there who is going to look for trouble. And we all, I think, agree that anytime anybody at a political rally decides that rather than words, they're going to use rocks or punches, then they need to be arrested and thrown in jail. And we need to do a better job. There's no question. What I held Trump responsible for were statements that he's been making all along that I believe, if anything, embolden thugs to do thuggish behavior. So allow me if I can to complete what I'm saying, and then I invite you to boo all you want. I know you'll feel free to do that. Okay. When Donald Trump launched his campaign, the statements made about Mexican immigrants being rapists and drug dealers. I can read the statements. I pulled them up if you like. So I can read them, but I encourage you to go back and look at them precisely so you can see what was said, because it wasn't just said on one occasion, but on several occasions. Okay? When you refer to a group of people as rapists, even if he were to constrain his reference to undocumented immigrants, but he didn't use the term illegal or undocumented. He's referring to Mexican immigrants. Okay, then. So I'm going to see if I can. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems. They're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're bringing rape. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. Now, the word illegal, undocumented doesn't appear anywhere in there. Okay, and this is a statement, he's referred to rapists several times. And so what we need to understand is we live in a very diverse community, like in all big cities. And you can imagine the anger. I know there are plenty of friends of mine in the Republican Party who abhor statements like that, because I don't believe Republicans are racist. I think most Republicans don't embrace statements like this. They may have serious objections to illegal immigration. They may believe we need to better enforce at the border. We need to deport. We need to do all the things we need to do to protect our country. But I don't believe the Republican Party is filled with a bunch of folks who believe that a category of immigrants are rapists. And that is precisely the problem. I understood that I did not affirmatively condemn violence when I should have. Similarly, Donald Trump needs to take responsibility for the fact he's not being very precise with his words at the very least. At the very least. At the most, he's offending severely thousands and thousands of law-abiding people in my city. Okay? And so when my 8-year-old cousin has to ask her mom, Mommy, why Does he believe we're rapists? That's a problem. And when Donald Trump is quoted as saying, as he did say, that if you see a protester, knock the crap out of them, right? Knock the crap out of them, and I'll pay for their legal fees. You need to understand these are not statements he just makes occasionally. There is a problem here, and we all need to take responsibility for our statements.
Mayor, I've written this down. I write instead of speak very well, so I wrote it down. As a mayoral candidate, we were at the mayor's debate. You said that unlike Mr. Cortese, you would not support a tax increase. You would fight for voter approval of pension reform all the way to the Supreme Court. Once elected, you supported a sales tax increase that can be spent on anything. You also capitulated to the unions and turned against the will of 70% of the voters by voting to invalidate pension reform through the court. In addition, you voted to support a welcome ordinance to citizens of other countries here illegally. Then you voted to create a new Office of Immigration Affairs. On June 2nd, you had the opportunity to side with peaceful residents that were acting within their right to assemble to hear their candidate, Donald Trump. But instead, as a very vocal supporter of Hillary Clinton, you blamed the violent actions on street thugs instead of laying the responsibility for the violence on the lawbreakers. Tell us why American citizens who live in San Jose should not demand your resignation.
So I know I addressed several issues there, but let me address the two new ones that you raised. One was the pension reform measure and what we've done with pension reform, and secondly, the tax increase, because I think those are the first two I heard that I want to be able to succinctly address. First, with regard to the pension reform settlement, the author of pension reform in this city, the man who led the effort is Chuck Reed. I supported Chuck Reed in that effort. I am grateful that the Republican Party strongly supported Chuck Reed and our effort for pension reform. Chuck Reed supported the settlement that we reached and did so with an op-ed in the Mercury News that we co-signed several months ago. The reason why he did that is for the reasons I described earlier. We reached an agreement that is going to save taxpayers $3 billion over the next 30 years. That's going to end a retiree health care defined benefit for new hires. It's going to save hundreds of millions of dollars. It's going to result in a lower tier of pension benefits. It's going to end supplemental pension payments. It is a series of reforms that will save taxpayers money and make for a more fiscally sustainable city. We are going to the voters in November. And in the agreement that was signed in December of last year, it explicitly said, we are going to the voters in November. And here's what it's going to have to say in that November measure. This, and this. And the public is going to have a lot of time to scrutinize exactly what's in that measure. You can get an early glimpse of it now on the city website because we have a preliminary language that's already been set up. It's going to be revised slightly. We'll be voting finally on the ballot language on the first week of August, as we always do when we send measures to the ballot. Then for the next 3 or 4 months, there'll be a lot of opportunity to scrutinize every single word in that measure. So we're going to go back to the voters to seek approval for that pension reform. That's first. Second, on the tax. I opposed, along with Mayor Chuck Reed, a sales tax back in 2014 because, for two reasons. One was we hadn't yet resolved the pension reform battle. And as I said very clearly then, and I've been saying since, I don't believe we should increase revenues. We should not be asking taxpayers to pay a cent more until we've fixed the problem at City Hall, until we've tightened our belts. And so that was the strategy that Chuck Reed laid out in 2010 when we had our fiscal reform plan. It was, we have to do these dozen things or so everything from reforming disability to eliminating sick leave payouts to obviously the pension reforms that are referred to, the medical retiree reforms, a whole series of changes. We had to check those boxes to show that we can tighten our belts first, because any tax increase would just be sending taxpayer money into a black hole. And we weren't going to do that. That fiscal reform plan called for a tax increase in 2010. And we pulled on it, I think, a half dozen times between 2010 and 2016. We pulled on it repeatedly. And, you know, I had the conversations with Chuck. We agreed, doesn't make sense to do it. We're not really sure the voter support or not, but we haven't fixed the problem yet. And we hadn't. And Chuck did everything he could have possibly done in 2012. We put a measure on the ballot. It got tied up in litigation. Part of it got struck down in the courts. We couldn't implement it. We had to come to some settlement with the unions if we were going to deal with that issue. We were finally able to reach that agreement and make the changes that we had committed to make many years before. That is when I decided it's now the time to go back to the voters. And we have passed the provisional budget on that sales tax measure. 93% of those dollars are going to two priorities: fixing roads and public safety. And by public safety, I mean fire and police. 93% of those revenues are going to those two purposes, which were the two highest in polling when we surveyed residents again and again and again about what their priorities were.
Hi, I'm Ron Meyer. I was at
Ron.
Trump rally and witnessed the chaos there. Fortunately, I avoided it because I parked on a lot over on 3rd Street and basically went around it and avoided the violence because I saw what was happening. Yeah. Since you brought up the term racism, I have Webster's dictionary here. I think maybe you need to get a definition here because your implication of what Trump said has nothing to do with race. Racism, a belief that the race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race, a racial prejudice or discrimination. Examples of racism were the Nazis during World War II, apartheid in South Africa. That's racism, sir. Nothing that Trump said implied anything to do with racist. And your implication that what he said was racist, according to this definition, is bogus. Where in the heck do you come off implying a person's implication of a racist statement when you don't even know the definition?
Ron, thank you for your statement. I appreciate your statement. So let me respond.
Yeah,
First, I don't compare Donald Trump to the Nazis. I think there's no question. That's not the problem here. All right? So let's try to avoid the extremes. The question is, what was said, is it responsible or not? Gonzalo Curiel was a federal prosecutor when I was a prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He was a man who was threatened repeatedly by Mexican cartels. In fact, he had to live on a military base for a year because he was prosecuting drug cases, and the Arellano Felix cartel had plans to kill him as a prosecutor. And those plans were intercepted by the FBI, and so Gonzalo lived for a year in hiding on a military base, but continued to come back and prosecute those cartels. He became a federal judge. I think you know where this is going. Gonzalo Curiel was the federal judge who was condemned by Trump for having bias in that case involving Trump University. And the bias was identified as being, well, he's Mexican. Gonzalo Curiel was born in Indiana. Those statements were condemned by Paul Ryan. Those statements were condemned by a lot of prominent Republicans as being completely beyond the pale. Because many Republicans don't believe that because someone is Mexican American, that makes them biased in how they'll rule as a judge. And I believe that's what many Republican leaders said, because that's the way many Republicans feel. That those kinds of statements are not justifiable. And I believe, yes, it's racist.
Well, let me make a rebuttal. Just a rebuttal. We got a Supreme Court justice.
Okay, I'm sorry. We have to take our next question. Thank you, Ron. Okay, next person. Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Mayor.
Hi.
My name is Linda. I just, a comment, then I'm going to tell you my situation. I think it would be extremely crazy for you to be talking about Donald Trump when you support a candidate who has lied and has been under criminal investigation since before she was in the White House. Okay, so if we're going to talk about character, let's talk about 4 dead people in Benghazi and somebody sleeping through it. Okay, that's what I have to say about that. Secondly, when I went to the Trump rally, I had some people with me who had never been to a rally. As a conservative, I have been at a lot of places where there's rallies and a lot of places where there's the other side, who is the renegade, who are the troublemakers, who are not even citizens or residents of the area. I know how brutal they are. I know how strong they are. And I assured my friends, don't worry, because the police will do their job. What they'll do is they'll make them stand across the street and separate them, and we will not. They can heckle us. I'm going to tell you. So they will heckle us, whatever, but we won't get hurt. Now, what happened was not because there was a shortage of police. It happened because the police did not separate the protesters, which very easily could have done. They were standing at the Civic Auditorium at the side of us. And so that their mistake was not, it was logistical.
You're right.
They should have kept them across the street. Yes. We all would have gotten in our cars. There wouldn't have been any damage. Right. And at one point, I was actually pushed into the crowd by one of your policemen with a baton in my back trying to push me into the protesters. So I would say that it's unfortunate that the chief of police isn't here, who said he was going to be. But I believe that and several officers have said that they did have a stand-down order. Nobody wants to take responsibility. But I think actually what happened is a good thing, because really now you know the face of the enemy and what they will do at any cost to hurt and take away your free speech, which is what they wanted to do.
Linda, I just want to say, I think you're right that the key problem was that the protesters should have been pushed back, or simply people should have been routed differently. There should never have been that mixing. That was the huge tactical mistake.
Huge.
And let me explain how it got there. And I'm sure Eddie, our chief, Eddie Garcia, would be happy to talk to this organization as he's talked to other Republican organizations like the Central Committee, and he can go into this in all great detail. Again, I'm not the expert, but what I do know is that the plan was to have attendees at the rally walk out, go south along Market Street, away from the protesters, and come back along Ballbach to get back to the parking, the cars. Two problems with that. First was apparently a lot of the attendees parked in other places throughout the downtown. They didn't coordinate the parking well enough. And again, with more time and planning and with this knowledge, clearly we recognize that was a mistake. We should have ensured that all the attendees would park in one place so we could get them safely out.
Right.
And rather than being dispersed throughout the downtown. So that was one big problem. The other big problem was there was a lack of coordination, I believe, with the Secret Service and the Trump campaign and the department, because occasionally, I guess what was different this time is Donald Trump stayed afterward to sign some signatures and sign autographs and so forth. And I believe Eddie Garcia will tell you this, that there was a lack of coordination with the Secret Service because they need to get him out of there first and foremost, right? Because they know that's a big issue with security. Right, and they got him out of there quickly and safely. The problem was because he stayed, they could not send attendees back toward Ballbach because he was in the same location, and they didn't want attendees going in while they're trying to get his car's motorcade out.
Right.
And so the problem was in the coordination there. And they should have had the Secret Service say, look, get him out, or have him go somewhere else to sign autographs so you're not blocking the intended path where we're going to send the attendees. And because of that, they rerouted. And that was the tactical mistake, where the attendees were mixed in, or in the same direction as the protesters, and then all the disaster, right? So that is what I understood the tactical mistake. I'm sure Eddie would be happy to address this group and describe in greater detail.
And
Wait a minute, we're going to take one more question. The mayor has to leave in a few minutes. We acknowledge that we've had there's a lot of frustration, and we do appreciate the mayor being here. We'll take one more question from Eva.
Just a comment. I'm going to ask.
Hi, I'm Eva Macias, and I just want to make one statement, what you say about races. About Mexicans. I'm from Mexico City. I'm proud to be born Mexican. Thank you. It was a huge diversity. It was people from Asia, from Europe. I'm proud Mexican. I was more sad to see how they were destroying my flag. People, Mexicans, hitting people with the flag to elderly people. I was there. I'm Mexican. And I don't get offended what Trump say about rapists. Because you know what? I know rapists. It doesn't fit to me. But I'm from Mexico, and I can tell you several stories about that. People who emigrate here, trafficked human, is supported by the Democratic Party because they let people to come here and they are rapists and the border. I would recommend to watch the movie Cartel Land. Cartel Land. It's how the villagers from Mexico and from here they try to save the country. I don't want to see this country, what is going my country hostage by Hillary Clinton when it's fast and furious with weapons is killing millions, hundreds of people in Mexico. Double standard about guns, control guns. Here they want to control guns. Why do they send thousands of guns to Mexico killing innocent people? Why? Double standard. Now my question, are you going to be loyal and faithful to the people who elect you or to your party?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And first of all, let me just say, I thought it was disgusting what they were doing at the American flag as well. And I think we all agree there were thugs in that crowd who we want to arrest if they haven't been arrested already, and they should go to jail if they committed any violence. Now, the question is, am I going to be loyal to the people who elected me or my party? So let me be very clear. I stood up against my party to stand for pension reform repeatedly over the last several years. I've never had the endorsement of a single union at any time in my political career. I did not have the endorsement of the Democratic Party when I ran for mayor. They opposed me, and they spent almost $2 million to defeat me. I did not have the Democratic Party's endorsement when I ran for city council in 2006. They spent money against me and tried to defeat me. I do not have loyalty to a party. I have time and time again stood up against the party. I know we have a difference of opinion about presidential candidates, and that's okay. I have lots of Republican friends, just as I have lots of Democratic friends who aren't necessarily aligned with their party on their presidential pick. That is not an issue of party. It's an issue of conscience. We decide to vote for whoever it is we believe is best for the job. What I'll commit to each one of you is I'll come back here as many times as you want to pose tough questions, as many times as you want to discuss difficult issues. And I first of all, really appreciate the fact that people have come to me today to say exactly what's on their mind, not to hold anything back. We've got to have very honest, brutally honest conversation. But you'll need to appreciate also, if I think I'm right, I'm not going to back down. If I think I'm wrong, as I did on a couple of occasions today, I'll admit I'm wrong. But we need to have an honest dialogue. And I'm glad we had to start today. Thank you.
we have to acknowledge, we have to thank Mayor Liccardo for being a stand-up and coming and speak to us. I know thank you. I know there's a lot of frustration in this room, but I do appreciate that Mayor Liccardo made the effort to come here. And Mayor, we will hold you to your word that you will come back and talk to us sometime. And thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause? And thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.